Guys, look at this. Boom. Boom. That Moai. Huge Moai, massive Moai, 200-ton Moai, 20 meters. Easy peasy. Check out this part here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Moai. All collapsed in a line. Straight from their quarry. Oh, 6, 7 really. If you include those ones. All in a line, all in the same part of the quarry. It's crazy. It's crazy. Look at this, zooming out. You can see the whole Rapanui quarry. Guys, an explorable 3D map of Rapanui quarry has just been released. I know you want to check it out. The link is down below. I had the pleasure of chatting to Professor Carl Lipo, an absolute expert on Rapanui, on these incredible Moai. Guys, pull it up and come explore Rapanui with me right now from the comfort of your own home. There's literally nothing better to do right now than that. I promise you. Could you possibly introduce yourself for those who may be unaware?
Yeah, I'm Carl Lipo. I'm an anthropologist here at Binghamton University, which is a university in upstate New York.
Okay. And I think I first became aware of your work when I saw Moai walking across a path, I think.
Yeah.
But could you tell us like your main area of interest? Why,
Yeah. Rapanui is this sort of mind-blowing place. I mean, it's this tiny speck of land, thousands of miles from anything else out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And it has just some of the most incredible archaeology that you find anywhere, all condensed in this 6 by 10 mile wide area. And it's always been, I mean, since I was a kid, I was always interested in the fact that people in the past did really remarkable things, kind of things that we consider crazy, whether that's Stonehenge or pyramids or earthen mounds. There are things that people did that don't make sense to us, that I've always wondered, like, it had to make sense to them. It doesn't make sense to us. Why would you do this in a remote place like that? But it must have made sense to them. And, I was working with Terry Hunt, who's at the University of Arizona right now. And we decided, let's go to the place with the most unlikely people to have done something really remarkable, Rapanui. We started to work there about 20 years ago. And our studies there took us all over the island looking at lots of different things. And we actually, initially, when we started working, we wanted to avoid the whole issue of Moai themselves. Like, let's not, because everyone goes there and, wants to focus on the Moai, but the Moai don't really exist without understanding the community and all the stuff that's going around it. Where were people eating? Where were they growing food? Where were they living? And how was the community organized? And how were they getting resources and all that part? So we really understood that part of it. And we tried to avoid let's not focus on the Moai stuff, but we ultimately stumbled across it by noting in the archaeological record that there's all this evidence that pointing us to the way in which people moved the statues. And that became a book that we started writing about how we came to sort of a conclusion about how they moved. And we were asked to do a TV special because TV, of course, wants to see that for real. So this was a Nova special back in 2012. And they said, well, why do you move one? We're like, well, we could try, but we're not the pilots of these things. We're the engineers. We understand how they move, but actually moving them is other knowledge. But they said, no. Actually, why don't you try it? And we're like, okay, let's make it out of foam because it's TV. How would you know? Like if it's not, no, it has to be real. It has to be concrete. So they built this one that was a replica of a statue that you find on one of the roads that are constructed there. That's, about 4.3 tons or so. Incredibly heavy, immovable object, the classic little object. And what you see on YouTube videos, make this long story short, is the success that we had when we finally got the combination of attributes right, where we were pulling on the ropes on both sides with the rope in the back, that enabled the Moai go from something that was completely immovable. You couldn't shake it. You couldn't fake it into something that was dancing down the road. And it was mind blowing. And, when people see that video and they're like, it's sort of stunning. It's like amazing to see this thing lumbering down the road. And it really was for us too, as we saw that. And that became, that really illustrates sort of this ingenuity of people on the island, that they made these statues, they moved them across the island, miles and miles across the island, but they did it in an incredibly smart, innovative way that enabled them with relatively small populations, with relatively limited resources, do it very efficiently. It's amazing. So that sort of it blew up in terms of, the media stuff, but it's really is a testament to the Rapanui people and what they were able to achieve with the resources they had on the island.
It is incredible. I think anyone that loves archaeology, loves human history, they have to know about Rapanui. I think outside of the pyramids, I think it might be the most famous archaeological zone,
it maybe competes with Stonehenge underneath the pyramids. Like the pyramids are it's worth going to. I mean, people, it's good to always say this. There are people living on the island. They're Rapanui people speaking Rapanui. They're descendants of the ancestors that made the statues. They still live there. People often think it's a windswept rock, abandoned. But no, people are there, living there, that speak Rapanui, and it's a fantastic place to visit. And so you can go and see these hundreds and hundreds of statues. The whole island is sort of it's effectively an archaeological site that just has just incredible things to see. And what's from an archaeological perspective, all that material is there on the surface that you really have the evidence that you need to sort of put this puzzle back together and figure out what was going on there.
Can you give us a sense of how remote Rapanui is?
Yeah.
It's pretty out there, I think.
It's way out there. So when you take, from here, I'm in New York. So, you go to JFK or some of the big major airport, you fly to Santiago. From Santiago, you fly 5 hours straight out to sea, so you go over 2,000 miles out to sea to the speck of land. But once you get there, it's 2,000 miles to anything else around it. There's nothing else. That island, that triangle that you see in the Google Earth imagery is the only island, which is something it's important to appreciate that when people got to this island and when they were living there, that was their universe. Like there wasn't another island they could jump off to. There were no other resources they could get other than what they had on that island, which really shaped the way in which they used the resources. They were forced to have to deal with those constraints of living on a remote island. It's incredibly isolated from everywhere else, but they did it. They got there 13th century AD or so. We're there up until European arrival in the 18th century, in 1722, when the Dutch arrived, and then are still there today.
Yeah, it's such a testament in a way to like human tenacity and achievement. Even being able to get to this island, in the 13th century is remarkable. Yeah, interesting. Let me share my screen. Let's look at this.
I think it's worth noting that up until this point, the quarry is relatively undocumented. I can show you maps that are produced, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is simply there haven't been that many people working on the island. It's sort of remarkable how few researchers there have been. It's partly because it's remote, it's so expensive to get to, and once you have to get there, you're kind of isolated. But two, this three-dimensional surface, once we zoom in here, is incredibly complex. You've got things embedded in other things, overlapping things. Traditional technology using sort of pen and ink is going to be very difficult to capture the details here. So maps just don't really provide the information you need to really study this place. More recent stuff using GPS, point proveniences, again, doesn't really capture the structure and the details and sort of the complexity of this surface. So, this UAV technology, which we use just a small, is a Mavic 3, a DJI Mavic 3, incredible jump in technology. You can go from taking, we collected, I think for this image, 22,000 photos over a couple of days, and then use computer software that's now available to stitch that all together to create this 3D model. And it's really exciting about how this technology really enables us to capture detail and sort of structure in a way that was never really possible before at level that precision that's, centimeter level precision, that we can then do that over and over again and really track changes and look at what's going on there.
I know the detail is really remarkable, actually.
It's incredible.
When you zoom in.
I'm always blown away when I look at it. It's like, it's almost, if you're there, you get to see even closer, but you can see things in ways that you can't actually see if you're on the ground, because it's a 3D cliff and you're not able to walk on the surface. It's too steep in some areas. You can get perspectives that are just impossible in any other way. So it's a fantastic tool for really visualizing and understanding this quarry.
Yeah, I had this big 3D map. I highly encourage, people watching this to pull this open in another window whilst we're talking, because it is so cool to explore. I told you just before I started recording, when this popped up on my things you might like or something at the start of the day, it literally almost derailed my entire day. I was exploring it for hours. There was a paper that came along with it as well. And I didn't fully appreciate, you said there are 1,000 Moai on Rapanui, is that right?
Yeah,
more or less?
That's what's amazing. Like one Moai in a place like this would be, wow, this crazy giant statue. But there are nearly 1,000 statues. 600 have been moved out of the quarry. So they're out scattered around the island at the Ahu, the platforms on which they put them. And about 400 or so that are still in the quarry and levels of construction.
That's incredible. I had no idea. If I had to guess before I read that how many Moai there were, I would probably have said maximum 100 or something.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, 100 would be amazing. But it's mind blowing what people were able to achieve there. It's just wow. It's like an order beyond what you could imagine.
So could you tell us the name of this quarry and sort of where it is on the island and the significance of it?
The quarry is known as Rano Raraku. Rano is a lake, and Raraku is the lake that's in the quarry. It's on a volcanic crater called Maunga Eo. which is a vent of one of the three volcanoes that form the island. It's actually a vent of Poike, which is the volcano to the east of that crater there. Formed about 200 to 400,000 years ago or so.
Interesting.
It's an interesting volcano crater because the stone is formed of ash. At the time in which this crater was blowing out ash, it was underwater. It was sort of shallow underwater crater. And as the ash blew through the water, it sort of created this glass-like crystals that then fused together to create sort of this compressed ash feature that formed around the crater itself. And that's what the material that the statues are made out of.
Interesting. Was this an area where, obviously this is where the Rapanui are quarrying these famous moai. Was it a place where they were farming and living as well? Or was it this kind of separate to that?
That's actually a good question. I mean, there's a bit of debate about it. There are some people who are arguing like this is the breadbasket of Rapanui, that people, this was the center and they farmed a lot here. Certainly, one thing that's interesting about the sediment, the rock of the quarry, is that it has higher potassium, some other minerals, which make it a little more productive than the other soils around it. One of the things about Rapanui, which is important to know, is that the soils are very non-productive. They're old enough. They're well drained by rainfall, which means a lot of the nutrients get pulled out of it, which means that cultivation there is very distributed and sort of dispersed around it because you can't really depend on any particular area for growing stuff. This is slightly more productive. On the other hand, so it could be the bread, place where people ate food or grew food, but we don't see a lot of evidence of that happening. We don't see the gardens and the other kinds of things that would be around here. So certainly some cultivation occurred around this, but I don't think when we see cultivation literally all over the island. It doesn't look like this was a center of that. Mostly this area was used for carving the statues.
Okay. Speaking of the statues, I want to start over here, if that's okay. And feel free to interrupt me at any moment.
Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting that so many of the moai end up distributed across the island, as you said, but there was this quarry sort of on the interior of the volcano. And it's almost like, this is almost like the last place you would think you would start quarrying if you want to transport them across the island in a way.
You're inside the crater. Yeah.
Inside the crater. I just wonder if these sort of moai that are standing here, is this where their intended destination was? Is that a hard question to answer?
Yes and no. I mean, it's important to sort of look at where they start and how they end up in the different places that they end up. The statues all are carved fairly high on the cliff. If you look in this particular image, you got the different figures highlighted in different colors, which I think you can turn on and off. But so they start up high on the cliffs and they carve out the face first, and then they start carving around the body, and then they separate it from the bedrock. What they do is then when they separate from the bedrock, they're carving them on basically faces are up, looking upward, and they have to carve on the back. And when they separate from the bedrock, they have to go underneath the statue and from both sides and ultimately find a place where they could connect and disconnect that. What that means is that the backside has kind of a crude shape to it. That's kind of a keel because they're coming in on both sides where the two sort of carving areas meet. What they do is they slide it down the slope into trenches that are at the bottom. And then they use those trenches in order to finish the statues. So the statues that you see at the bottom that are standing there, which are all full statues, and they're not just heads. And everyone's known that for 100 years, even though that meme goes around a lot, are statues that are in the process of being finished. Now, some of the statues may have been brought there and then abandoned for various reasons, or the Europeans arrived and people were like, oh, let's go see what the boats, what's happening over on the coast. But these are statues that are basically being prepared for transport. You can often tell that that's the case because if you look at the backs are kind of crude in the sense that typically you see the heads are slightly notched forward and there's materials. And that's a good example there. You see that in that one on that sort of foreground that you're looking at.
This one here.
The head there isn't really a back shoulder that like you would see in a person. It's sort of flat. And that's typically because that's the flat surface that used to be connected to the bedrock. And they've got to shape the back of the head and the shoulders to finish it. And the only way they can do that is with it standing upright. So what they're in is trenches that are now filled in from erosion or other kinds of materials and then left. The question is really, did they purposely fill it in and then we're going to abandon it? We actually don't know, but I suspect a lot of them are they didn't work on it full time. So they came here episodically and they just may have stopped working on it for whatever reason. The other thing is that as they're carving these, they sort of realize what's going to work and not work in terms of transportation. If you don't get the balance of the statue right in terms of the base and the stomach, then it's never going to be able to walk, because if the balance really matters. So I suspect some of them are abandoned because they're like, oh, that's never going to go anywhere. Let's start again. When you're carving stone like this, if you make a mistake, you can't like stick the stone back in. You're kind of stuck with whatever shape you've got. And, carving the statue part of the process may be just carving the statue. Whether it gets moved out may not be the most important thing.
Oh, interesting.
I think there's a bit of like boastfulness that people are doing here, that, they're carving statues and going like, look what we're doing. And sometimes that boast works and you don't have to finish it. And sometimes you got to keep going because you're kind of competing with other groups.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm just seeing if I can find a way. I know there's a way to turn off some of these colors.
So we're trying to, one of the things we're trying to do is count the features there.
Yeah.
One of the things that people have said, there's X number of features, but the challenge has always been, okay, where are they? Like, if you find something else, is it new or is it one that someone's counted? So we're trying to just say like, this is what we counted. I suspect we didn't find everything, they're probably, even in this image, I suspect there are more things that we didn't see, but we wanted just to capture like, okay, at this moment, at this time, with this image, with this 3D model, here's what we found. Let's continue to look, let's fly again. Let's analyze this further. I suspect there's a lot more. There's grass growing here and other things that sort of obscure the surfaces. So, but we really want to be able to say this is an inventory, the best inventory we have right now.
Yeah, it's incredible, really.
By the way, the crater, inside of the crater, once they get them in the trenches there's actually a pass that they can walk them out of. And in fact, there's statues in the pass that were felled during the process of.
Oh, really? Oh, is that over here, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly. And there's statues over there. You can see that one right there. That's like was on its way out and whomp, fell on its
face down. Yeah.
So there is a pathway. They clearly moved them over, from inside to outside and brought them out to the rest of the island.
Wow. Okay. So if they choose to quarry one from the inside, they've got to walk it sort of along here, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly.
And then down through this
over
gap.
There and then down that path.
Wow. I saw in your paper that there are sort of these different areas of quarrying that you've identified. They're sort of highlighted with these white outlines, I believe.
Yeah.
So different quarries, perhaps.
Yeah. So one of the questions about the quarry, people describe it in various ways. How is it so structured, organized? Is it quarry done as this giant factory where people are systematically moving through the stone and making these statues in different ways? Are there different statues, the quality of statues from different areas? Sort of understand their structure. One thing that people in the past. Sebastian Englert, for example, said that he heard from oral traditions that the statues were carved by multiple groups working sort of side by side. And, what we wanted to see is the fact, is that documented in the quarry itself? When you look at it, you actually can see pretty clearly like the areas that are separate from each other, where there's consistent sets of carving going on in a small area that look like workshops that are independent of each other. So It's not as though there's a big organization at the top. It's really smaller groups working side by side. And that's very consistent with what we see in the rest of the archaeological record. The ahu that are around the island really look like, well, they're functionally redundant with each other, and that they're small groups working together at each individual ahu, growing their food, living there, and then building these giant monuments and bringing statues to them. There's 140 different Moai ahu around the island, ahu with Moai on them. All of those are independent groups working side by side. Now, of course, temporally, there's probably some set of those that are contemporaneous, but we really do get the pattern of small groups working independently of each other and competing with each other, not a sort of top-down chiefdom level kind of structure.
So are these, for example, this one here, you can so clearly see these all four side by side.
Yeah.
One seemingly successfully removed here, another one here.
That's what's so cool. You can see like all of the steps that are going in here when people start the statues, when they're in the middle of making the statues, when the statues have been removed out, failures. Like you can see the one there that's got the belly and the head's broken off. So
this one here, yeah.
Yeah. So, something happened and, the head broke off. They removed that. And then, okay, well, that's a small chunk of stone with the body. You can find sort of all the successes and failures of this quarry, and
sort of like an early starting one here, maybe
exactly,
just like the initial.
Yeah, just beginning to carve out the face of it. It's like a laboratory. And you can imagine, 500 years of experimentation and attempts and failures and successes are all sort of aggregated here together. It's an incredible place to study.
Do you think, like, for example, this quarried section here represents the efforts of one family, one clan? Like, who are the different groups that are producing these at different points?
That's what we
Do you see
think.
what
I mean, it's probably clan based, larger than a single family, but some group that's related to each other. And those are the groups that are working and living around individual Ahu. That's our hypothesis. It mirrors itself in other aspects of the archaeological record. We can see that at Orongo, another area, but also within just sort of the community structure of the island. What's kind of advantageous for us is starting with looking at community structure first and settlement patterns, and then looking at how small, sort of the scale of those community patterns. And then that gave us sort of sense of how the island's organized. And we can really see that replicated here in the quarry.
It's so interesting. So I guess then if these are all different groups doing this, that there's a big element of competition here going on in this production, would you say?
Yeah. I mean, that's what's sort of fascinating about this is that essentially the solution that people found on this small island with limited resources, where there could be incredible amounts of competition over the finite resources. In fact, the kind of competition that led people like Jared Diamond to argue sort of that led to ecocide and people eating each other and all kinds of terrible stuff, instead was a competition that didn't lead to that kind of behavior, but in construction of these giant monuments, that people competed through creating monuments and showing off to each other. This is basically the classic costly signaling model. And it really fits incredibly well when you see the kind of the way in which the resources are distributed, the scale of the monuments scale to the resources that the communities have. It really is about, these are the equivalent of McMansions. Groups are showing off to each other what they're able to achieve. I suspect that's one of the reasons why, you make a big statue or make a bunch of statues and you may or may not need to finish them, because if the other groups you're competing with are like, whoa, that's enough, like that, you won. You don't have to carry through. But sometimes the groups are like, well, okay, let's see you move that guy. That's big, but like you got to get it from here to there. And then, that goes on. And then sometimes they fail. And we find about 60 statues between the quarry and the Ahu. They fell. And that was one of our clues for the transport. And then sometimes they get them all to the Ahu. And then sometimes they fall once they get to the Ahu. I mean, there's a lot of failure here, but they, also achievements and fun. But so I do think that's pretty much what looks like it's really explaining this interesting combination of cooperation, the groups working together as small groups, and the competition between those groups really makes this place resilient, despite the fact it's remote and has a lot of environmental challenges.
Interesting. I mean, there are these two super prominent ones here on the side of this quarry, which are
Tekokanga.
I mean, this one must be 3 times the size of this one here.
That's the puzzling one. Like it's so big. It would have been 270 tons. The biggest one that was moved out of the quarry is 82 tons. Which is colossal. It's 3 stories tall, like monumental in scale. This thing is even bigger than that. It's 5-story building or something crazy, and many, many more times its size. Now the question is, was it ever going to go anywhere? It probably not. If you look at the belly and the sort of the distribution of the weight, it wouldn't have had the stability that you see in the other statues. The statues that were able to be moved tend to have a slightly wider base than the shoulders, and that gives it stability. And the belly's big enough to have a center of mass that's slightly lower than the mid of it. If you have a center of mass that's way up high, you rock it side to side, it's going to tip over. But when you look at the ones that they're moving and the ones that in the process of being carved and the ones that are in the transport, they tend to have a very consistent center of mass and shape, because that's what makes the transport possible. Once you get them this scale, I don't think you could have moved it. And there's other clues to that. But this, again, may be this boast, like, look at the gigantic thing we're making,
Yeah.
And it worked. Like, whoa, okay, back off. We don't, they'll try somehow to move it. But I don't think it could have been walked.
And next to it here, where there's this enormous deep quarry, and there's still many Moai incomplete there, unless they never intended to be moved them. Do you think, like, this sharp drop here, is this sort of multiple Moai being removed from this section?
Probably spaces where there were statues and they carved them out and moved them. Again, 600 statues around the island. It's a lot of stone that they moved out of there.
Yeah, it is incredible, really. I love seeing this one. There's the quarried gap and then the broken head at the bottom. Exactly. Like, was this a part of this, or was this successful? And then they tried again and it broke.
You can imagine like all the cries of anguish, we're almost done, crack.
Yeah, with so many being carved, that sort of changed my mind on this a little, or made me think a little bit. Are there many more smaller Moai across the island, or are they all kind of like giant rocks, basically? Are they, what's a small Moai? Is it like human sized?
No, I mean, generally speaking, they're, I think 12 feet tall, 10 to 12 feet tall is the smallest size. I mean, there are some little mini pocket moai. Some of the older moai are actually pretty small. And generally speaking, as they later in time, they get bigger and bigger. They don't all get bigger. There's also smaller ones, but they tend sort of the more common size is at least 10, 12 feet. They're big.
So they're all for the most part large in scale. This is big architecture, big monumental. So yeah, this one 9.4 meters.
Yeah, I mean, it's like huge.
That's the thing. When I'm here on my computer, it's hard to appreciate the scale of it a little bit.
No, you get going there, you're like, holy cow, these things are gigantic.
Yeah, let's see this big boy over here. Let's see what's going on here. One moment.
That's what's, going there, you really do get appreciation for the magnitude. Photos, you can't get a sense like just how colossal this is.
Wow, 20.3 meters. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's enormous. I'll put the feet on the screen for my American viewers, but that's enormous. that's like 60 foot, roughly.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, interesting. With Rapanui, you mentioned briefly a moment ago, there are all sorts of ideas about Rapanui, about how this civilization came to be, how it came to an end. What's your opinion on the I don't know if it's even fair to talk about the decline of Rapanui, to be honest. There must have been some decline during European colonization. I know it was a hard time. But does this statue building, does it sort of threaten the stability of their society, would you say? Is that a fair way to put it?
No, I actually think what we actually see is increased investment in statues over time. Statues, I think, became more and more essential over time for the resilience and stability of the population itself. It ends when Europeans arrive because of a couple of things. Disease has a huge impact. Economic differences, partly is there's an economic advantage. The competition sort of enables groups to sort of mitigate conflict that they had. But once you get, because it's sort of one thing to imagine that you're on this island, you're on this, speck of land, and the resources you have are rocks, different kinds of rocks, and not much else, right? So if you're going to compete with people, there's nothing you can own that no one else has, right? What you can compete with is what you can achieve. Like you can make something and say, look what we can do. Europeans arrive and they bring all kinds of goods with them. They bring hats and clothing and metal goods and stuff like that. We really see a quick change in the sort of competition that goes on in Rapanui into ownership of things. Very, very different kind of. And I think what happens is there's an abandonment of this particular kind of competition, the sooty tern egg that's offshore, competition about ownership. And that changes sort of the relationship of the community and, its organization. And this sort of becomes like less important because now you could own something in a way that wasn't possible before. You really see that a change. If you read the European accounts are really interesting about how Rapanui people interact with Europeans. They're giving up stuff. They're trading, they're very interested in European goods. And you really see like sort of the loss of any attendance at the Ahu themselves and more attention to European stuff. And then of course that's happening at the same time with population loss due to disease and then all kinds of terrible other things that happen on Rapanui, slave raiding and horrible bits of history. So I don't think the decline is really a representation of something that they caused. It was sort of a consequence of the interaction with Europeans that sort of led to that. I think the statue construction, because what we really do see over time an increasing size, magnitude of the statues. We see a narrowing of the forms. Early on, you see a lot of different kinds of moai. There are ones with weird round heads.
Well, I was looking at this section. They seem to be smaller. This guy seems to be really sort of round in the head.
Yeah, there's some weird ones that are just like, don't look like the classic form. And those early forms are probably, people are competing, but the competition isn't so fierce. Over time, that competition, I think, gets more and more fixed and it becomes more of a grammar of how you make a statue, what competition looks like. And therefore, statues sort of become more formulaic in their shape because that's the formula to which that you were able to achieve that signal that works. It's sort of an interesting pattern history of how this played out.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had never really thought before about how the arrival of Europeans would have introduced this whole range of exotic goods. I mean, I know
it's game changing for them, right? I mean, you go from nobody, their universe was this island, and suddenly people come from elsewhere with stuff that you can't even imagine having. Like it was really a very different world.
Yeah. I had thought, I knew obviously that indigenous peoples traded with Europeans and for access to resources and stuff like that. But like you said, that when you're on this
That's it.
island before that point, I had never thought you couldn't own anything that no one else had.
I mean, maybe, driftwood would float ashore with some weird European bit on it, but, that was it.
Yeah.
What's interesting is when Europeans arrive, these are documented cases, there was a cargo cult. Rapanui people created earthen boats the size and shape of European boats, dressed up as captain and crew in order to attract Europeans to come to the island to bring their goods. It's really a dramatic shift. And of course, you can imagine it because it disrupts the idea that this is the island with the only resources on it. You suddenly have this whole idea there's other stuff out there.
Interesting. I had no idea about that. That's fascinating. It's like you said, it's really like there's sort of John from cargo.
No, it's exactly that.
From World War II. Yeah. Do we have any sense of how many people were involved in the construction of the Moai, and how many people it would take, maybe not to move a 20-meter monster, but say a more standard sized one? How many people would be involved in the production and transportation of it?
Good question. The construction is tough because it's hard to know as many people as possible in a small space, or is it a certain, the length of time and number of people could vary quite a bit. But when we look at the transport stuff, we were able to move our 10-foot tall, replica with 15 people. And of course, we were the least talented statue transport people on Earth, because, I had no idea how to do it. So I imagine Rapanui people would obviously be way better at it. But when we look at the physics of it, and so calculate the amount of force it takes to get it rocking from side to side, it actually tracks pretty well with the number of people that it took us to do it. But what's cool about the larger and larger statues is that as it gets larger, they get taller. And as it gets taller, you get more leverage. So in fact, it scales, the size of the statue scales really well with, you don't need that many more people to do it. So the largest statues, like an 82-ton statues, we've estimated would take the maximum of about 40 people just to get it going. Once you get it going, in fact, the momentum is conserved. So in fact, you don't need as many people to keep it going, but it wouldn't take that many people to move even the largest ones because of the scaling factor.
Would it be, I wonder if the biggest challenge then, let me ask your opinion on this, is the final positioning of it. Would that sort of finer, getting them all in a line be a real challenge?
Yeah, we were able to, one thing we wanted to see, could you pivot? How would you pivot it around? You get this thing walking. What was cool is that we were actually able to spin it around 360 by rocking in different directions. The challenge would be, and this is the hard part, which would be interesting to replicate. It's a practical problem. It's you've got these ropes and then you've got other statues. How do you, you're on a platform. I'm not exactly sure how that would all work,
Yeah.
And it depends on the distance between the Moai and on the Ahu. But there are certainly some technical challenges that they would have faced to get it up there. Lots of things to figure out.
Do you think these representing specific individuals, or are they representing something else?
Yeah, we do know, we don't know exactly. We know that they represent ancestors. That's a trait that's common across Polynesia. Large stone uprights, often wood uprights, and other Polynesians are called tiki. They're not all made of stone. It's an ancestral form of honorific construction that you do to represent ancestors. You put them up in high places to represent them. So that certainly could, Rapanui, what we know about Rapanui oral traditions, that's very consistent with, Polynesian traditions. They all did have names. So when Thompson in the 19th century went around, he recorded the fact that these all had names of them assigned by people, and they were probably related to some kind of ancestor. The question is is each form represent that person or the idea of that person? And it's hard to say because they're very stylized. It's not oh, this is a representation of Bob. It's, they're forms of some fashion. Some of that has to do with the sort of bowling pin shape with the sort of narrow head relative to the shoulders is likely have to do with the transport, that you've got to make it that bowling pin sort of low center of gravity, long stretched out heads is likely related to transport. So it kind of skews what the representation looks like, but they probably do represent important people that cast on. When they get to the Ahu, they're brought to the community and they're stood on the Ahu and they're turned around to look at the community. Often people think that these things are looking out to sea. But again, if you imagine there's nothing out to sea from the Rapanui perspective, everything that's important is on the island. So they're positioned on the Ahu to look at the community, and they're turned on once they get there. all of the statues that you see here and the statues that are intermediate between here and the Ahu insets where the eyes would be. Once they get to the Ahu, there are actually eye sockets carved into them, and coral and obsidian inlays are put into the eyes to turn them on so that the ancestors are literally looking at the community.
Interesting. Is this a small Ahu here? Or is this a
That's a
later
house
feature?
at the Hare Paenga, which is a boat-shaped house.
Oh, wow.
There's a little porch in front of it. So, people often say, oh, that's archaeologists often do this. They're like, oh, it's the elite house. Like, well, no, it's a house that's near a bunch of Moai. Elite, I don't know. It's there's a lot, archaeologists love to talk about the elites, and basically the correlation is that, oh, this must be elite, but it's a house.
Yeah, interesting.
Listen, what's great about the archaeological record here, there's been deforestation. When humans first get there, there's palm trees everywhere. But archaeologically, we know that at some point the trees went extinct. All of the archaeological record is right on the surface, so it's an incredibly perfect place to do remote sensing and use drones and photogrammetry to document it.
Interesting. It's such an interestingly proportioned house, sort of 10 meters long by just 1.5 wide.
Yeah, they're considered like canoe-shaped house. The idea is like an upturned canoe. So Europeans describe them as very long, narrow houses with entrances in the middle, just like you see here.
Yeah. Are they that way, do you think, because of resource?
I don't know. I think
resources, or is that?
I do think that there is a constraint. But I suspect the superstructure, the wooden superstructure, is probably conserved. What we find is actually reuse of the stones around it are large basalt stones, and they're carved specifically for these houses. They have holes carved into them to hold wooden poles. What we actually find is that the stone is reused and moved around into different of these houses because it's probably and we see additional holes being drilled into it. It's probably the case that the wooden superstructure is very, very important, and that's conserved and moved around and reused in different houses because wood is going to be, not a very abundant material on the island. They're masters of stonework. The carving the stone for the sort of curb of the houses is, you think is a colossal trivial part. It's the wood that's really the harder part.
Yeah, the wooden resources.
So out here, you can see statues that are in the process of being carved. You can actually see like the one in the middle of the screen, kind of in a pit that you can see that's
this one here.
Up. The one that's up to like up.
Oh, this one?
Or out to the right of that, right there. Yeah. So that one, is in a pit, clearly. It's actually looks like it's in a pit. So you imagine that was a trench that was carved in, that the statue was slid down and then put there. If you look at the back, you can see how rough it is. It's unfinished because it's still got the part of the bedrock from which it was detached before it was slid down. And now they've got it here up. Yeah. To finish off the back to make the head slimmer and to create the shoulders.
Interesting. I wonder if we can see, if it's possible to see which quarry. Do you think it's likely that it came from?
Probably, yeah, because it would make sense. It would be, slid down there. I know one of the things to do is try to refit bits into this to try to figure out where the statues went. Also, one thing we haven't done, which I suspect there's probably interesting stylistic differences between the different carvers working at the same places in terms of the shapes of the faces and the eyes and stuff. There's a lot of interesting analysis we want to do with this.
Yeah, I was thinking over here there was ones where the faces looked a little bit different. I want to say this one is almost smiling here.
Yeah, exactly. You can see like a little grin on its face. They're not all like that. Some of them have sort of pouty face. Yeah.
And the one next to it sort of has a grin, and maybe this one has a grin too.
Yeah, I suspect that's one thing is we really think that there's probably stylistic differences. Subtle, but there's differences.
And then I don't know. Others seem more stern. Let me just say, this one here seems more stern, I would say. This one here too, perhaps. I don't know. Interesting.
Oh, if you go straight in there, right in the center of the screen, so the upper center of the screen.
Here.
Going right there. Yeah, right in there. That's a good spot to look in it and turn so you can see. Turn it so you can rotate. There you go. You can see there where they're carving from both sides. They have to carve out the statue.
Yeah.
You can imagine how like the dangerous part would be you're carving from both sides. Man. Someone has to be in there chipping, and then it disconnects and thunks.
Well, that looks like that. It looks like it snapped, right? It
snapped. Yeah, there's probably a lot of curses with that.
Yeah, hopefully there was no one right there at the time. Was there any point where this construction was at its peak? Do we have any sense of that?
I wish we knew. That's one of the things that's sort of the crisis of Rapanui chronology is the fact we don't know. We know basically that people got there, 13th century, and then Europeans arrived in 1722. And between that, we have an incredibly lack of information. It's really hard to date these things. One, in order to do it here, you'd have to do a lot of excavation and get specific stratigraphic, charcoal from particular stratigraphic context and do a lot of it. And excavating here isn't something that the community is going to allow you to do wantonly. It's going to be a long drawn out. So we really don't know enough about the chronology here. Likely, it looks like people are starting to carve statues as soon as they get there. That from what we can tell, that happens really quickly. But what we see the earliest statues, and one of the cool things at the Ahu is that the Ahu are these constructed platforms. And when they get dismantled, we often find older statues inside the Ahu that were used as rubble, which indicates the fact that we can look at those statues and see the kinds of forms that were formed the earliest statues. They often are wildly different. So we know that all the statues that we see here aren't the earliest ones because there's other kinds of forms. We don't really know enough about the chronology.
Interesting. This one's being carved almost on the very edge of the cliff.
Very edge. I know. There's ones that are up there that are just like, how were you going to get that out of there?
I know. I wouldn't fancy, at some point you would hypothetically have to remove this and you're on quite a sharp edge.
Yeah.
I would not fancy that. That's incredible. Does it seem that the arrival of the Rapanui on the island, of Polynesian people on the island, that this was a one-way trip? I know the Polynesians were excellent seafarers, and in sort of the core region of Polynesia, if that's a fair thing to say, there was a lot of backwards and forwards travel, but was that the case for the people on Rapanui, do you think?
It doesn't look like it. I mean, if we don't really understanding sort of the earliest occupation island is something that would be interesting to know more about. Like, did people get there and then go back and say, hey, there's an island out here, and then went back? But once basically it got colonized, it doesn't look like there's back and forth interaction. And that's true for a couple of reasons in terms of evidence. One is that linguistically, we find the language, which is common across Polynesia, to be really distinct from the rest of Polynesia. So it really suggests when we other places where you see that kind of interaction, the language is very close to each other. It's, Rapanui people can understand other parts, Hawaiian and other parts of it, but it's quite distinct. And linguists have often said, have noted that and said like, well, because they must have gotten there earlier than anywhere else in East Polynesia. But really, it's because they're really isolated. The second line of evidence is the fact that when we look at the rat DNA, so whenever Polynesians get to these islands, they bring rats with them. These are little Polynesian rats, tree rats called Rattus excellens. The haplotypes of those rats there's only one haplotype of those rats. In other islands, we always see the rat, but we find multiple haplotypes, suggesting multiple introductions of the rat. We just don't see the same kinds of things that we get other islands where we see multiple, where it's likely there was back and forth interaction. It does look like these people are really isolated once they get there.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, 2,000 miles in every direction before you hit another piece of land. That's an extremely long voyage.
I mean, most likely people got to South America that, after this, because you wouldn't catch this by accident again. Interesting up here on top, you can see all these blocks. It's an interesting different form of carving in the sense that up here you get blocks being carved in advance of the faces, so they're shaping out the area that the statue will be in and then doing the carving. In other places you find the face first and then they carve around the head and then the shoulders and the body. But up here you see these block carving. So different styles of technology of carving.
Interesting. Different approaches to it.
Yeah.
Different methodologies. Yeah. Oh no, I thought that was a really worn one then, but maybe
you never know. I mean, I'm sure if people look at this, I'm sure they're going to see other things that we didn't, because it's like, an Escher, a 3D Escher drawing of statues. They're all embedded in these different things. They pop out in ways that you don't,
Yeah, that one's a really interesting one. Almost seems like the only bits sort of fully carved out on this one was the nose.
The nose and the chin.
Yeah, and then for whatever reason, it was abandoned. Some of them stylistically almost have quite different noses as well. That seems to be, that one has really
big prominent nose,
pronounced nose.
Yeah.
And then others, maybe it's just the angle. It seems flatter and wider. Yeah. When the first Europeans arrived, the statues were still standing on the island, I think, right?
They were.
Hadn't been knocked down.
Yeah, that's what's really cool is when reading all the early accounts of people, they all talk about how tall the statues were, the shadows that they cast. There's really no descriptions of fallen statues until Cook arrives, 1774. He's arriving a couple years after the Spanish are there. The Spanish are there for a couple of weeks and likely introduce disease. They're there long enough to have an impact from disease. And Cook talks about skeletons and dead bodies and things like that. So what you're seeing when Cook arrives is really the impact of Europeans, and statues are starting to fall. People, one of the things is that these statues on the Ahu are kind of giant stones on top of piles of other stones. And they probably take maintenance. You have to go there and make sure everything's balanced and, prop them up. So as people start, populations, get shrunk, people will stop attending to these ahu and they start to fall down on their own. One of the arguments is that people knock them over to get to each other. That's possible, but likely that there's a lot of falling down just because if you need to keep attending the statues. It looks like they also fell down during pre-contact times, and that the rubble statues, the statues that turn into rubble, are probably statues that were once standing and then fell in. This is the one female Moai. All of them are.
I was just gonna ask. I just noticed that. I was like, are all of these guys?
Yeah, they're all guys except for this one.
Wow, interesting. Is this also another potential female one?
Possible. It's like really rough there, but yeah, I don't know what that represents, but interesting. The one different one, and these are statues way up high that you can't even visit there. Which makes the drone 3D images, pretty valuable.
Yeah, I imagine if you're a tourist visiting, you're following this path.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and so you can't come up and see the only female Moai. Interesting.
Yeah, the male representation. I mean, the statues are male. I find it's interesting, the gender part, because it's not as though the male Moai are overly male, in the sense that they couldn't put anything they wanted to them on them,
Yeah.
So they're male, but not overly so. I know. I think it's telling us something about gender identity, but in some way, and I'm not sure. I could make a story up, but it's interesting how the sort of restraint they have about that.
Yeah, in an environment where you're constructing megalithic male statues to impress people.
Yeah, exactly.
You can easily imagine they would think of impressing people in other ways.
It wouldn't have. They could have done it.
Yeah. It's fascinating stuff, really. I've got to try and get to Rapanui.
Yeah, it's absolutely worth the trip. It's great hotels and people are fantastic. It's the runway there. People often go, well, how do you land on the plane? It was built in the 70s and rebuilt by the U.S. Air Force to land the space shuttle. When the space shuttle was flying, it would have been the emergency landing spot for the space shuttle. So it's a huge runway.
I feel like that says something pretty cool about humanity in a way, that on Rapanui you have this like older traditional form of megalithic architecture, such an incredible achievement for such an isolated people. And then in a space of 300 years, we're potentially landing space shuttles on there.
Yeah.
I imagine, with my understanding of the history of Rapanui, that after European contact, a lot of the sort of stories of these Moai were lost. And this is also home to perhaps its own writing system, Rongo Rongo, which also lost its, all the people who are able to read and write it. Is there sort of like a time period in particular where this information really is lost? I don't even want to say lost, because as you said at the start, there are still Rapanui people.
Yeah.
But
no, there's a lot of information was lost. I mean,
a
couple of things happened. One is Europeans would arrive, and then it would be, 25 years before. So they would introduce disease, and then it'd be 25 years before the next arrival of people. So there was a lot of just people dying without people recording that information any other way. And, of course, older people would die earlier. So you'd lose that sort of elderly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, in the mid 19th century, the Catholic priests arrived. And the Catholic priests, their job is to turn everyone into Catholics. And their job was basically to eradicate all the old traditions, as good Catholic priests. The mid 19th century really kind of wipes out a lot of information, and it's, just lost. So we have bits and pieces from, in relatively small number of people. So when you look at sort of who's passed on information from like Rutledge and others, it's like the same guy, there just aren't a lot of people to pass that information on. So we don't probably have the diversity and the range of information that was obviously there. This is why it makes archaeology that important, is that this is encoding that information in one way or the other. Like there's a lot to learn from this.
Yeah. I'm just looking here. There's two, speaking of stylistic differences, this one is so much shorter and squat, and this one is really long and thin.
Yeah. And there's one right next to it too. That's cool.
Yeah. And it's kind of incredible to think that they would presumably be trying to get this one out of this channel here.
Yeah. Would they have to carve that out before they could get it in? It's possible that would have cleared.
You'd think you'd have to remove all of this rock to get it out. But maybe they did, because when you look at the quarried space above, it is that wide. Yeah,
exactly. They didn't have any problem. Like, let's spend some time carving some rock. The rock itself isn't super hard. That's important. Like, it's a compressed ash. It's pretty friable in a sense. They're carving it with slightly denser other basalt objects themselves. So it's not impossible. It's certainly a lot of labor.
Do you have any sense of the time it would take to make a Moai? Or is that again, is this
It's tough. I
is
wish.
someone involved in one in their lifetime? Are they involved in 2, 3, 20? I mean, there's 1,000 of them. So
I know. So you have to kind of sort of figure out across the 500 years of occupation, how many on average were made in I mean, that's something to try to figure out. How do we what are the constraints? One of the things about the workshops is the space does constrain how many people. So you can sort of figure out, well, how many people could work side by side in those spaces. And if they were chipping over X amount of hours a day, it would take that many days times that many people. There might be a way to sort of figuring out the constraints by physics.
yeah, I wonder. I mean, if they're sort of 500 years, that's 2 a year on average. And then assuming they didn't start literally the very first year that they arrived, perhaps.
But, all these groups are simultaneously going. So if there's 20 groups working side by side across this area,
it would be hard to imagine, considering the number of them, that in the course of one person's life, you weren't working on multiple of them.
Probably multiple.
It would be hard to imagine that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
What's interesting is it, probably was a part-time job. Like, we often think about this as like this full laborers, craftsmen working there, chipping away, but I suspect it was something they would periodically go and do. They use dryland agriculture, cultivation. There's a lot of work going out in that because they're using lithic mulch, basically breaking rocks in order to enrich the soil. So they couldn't possibly be doing this as a full-time job. That's where the transport makes sense, that they were able to move. We were able to move walk a statue 100 meters in 40 minutes, again, as the worst statue transporters ever. I suspect the statue, if the road was prepared, if the path was prepared, they could move it, relatively quickly across from the quarry to the Ahu. The challenge is, of course, carving it in the first place. So, it's really about how much time could they spend doing that and not doing all the other things they needed to do.
Well, really an enormous one may have been removed from here.
Yeah.
This is too much fun to play around with, honestly. 18 meters.
I know, it's just mind-blowing, like how big these things are.
Yeah. Interesting. I wonder, you say that it's someone's part-time job. Humans do love to be entertained. We don't like to be idle. And again, I wonder if there's something about the extreme isolation of this island that also just on a need to occupy your time caused something like this without the distraction of trading with your neighbor, exotic goods.
This was
without
it.
any of that.
This was the job. Other than tending to crops and fishing, this was the job. And you would go there, and it had all the cultural parks, and clearly this. From an outsider, you look at this and go, "Oh, this is crazy," but this had to matter to them, both culturally as well as the act of doing it must have had benefits, right? It brought people together culturally. It allowed them to share information. It bound those groups together cooperatively to say, look what we were able to achieve, which means when things, that one didn't render too well. That's Turutuki. Maybe rendering now. I think they did it generation after generation. It couldn't have been something crazy. It had to be something that mattered and was important and it helped them. It was beneficial.
Yeah. Interesting. It really is.
The drone didn't get that photo very well because those cliffs are hard to image.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. I mean, it's incredible that I can even sit in the comfort of my office and explore Rapanui in this much detail.
Yeah.
The fact that one Moai didn't render so well is
there's more to do. That's the thing. There's way more to do.
Yeah. Interesting. I feel like this one is a very famous one. I don't know. Maybe because the prominence of the brow, it seems very well preserved. I don't know. I feel like I see pictures of that one a lot.
Yeah, those are
go.
the famous heads. It's like the heads would be straw, and there's always a photo of those.
There we go. Okay, under this video, dear viewers, there's going to be a GoFundMe page to send me to Rapanui in 2026.
It's worth it.
Is there anything you think we've missed? I don't want to keep you all day, even though I absolutely could.
Most of the stuff. It's interesting to look at the ones down below. It's sort of at the different stages because you really can see if you kind of have to look close and spin around, but you can see the ones that are just being prepared. That there's thicker backs of the heads, thinner ones that are being readied. You can kind of see like here that one there. You can see how it's got the shoulder there, so it's ready. It's in the trench. The question is like, why didn't they move it? But of course, it could be Easter Sunday, 1722, like, oh, what's that crazy thing that just appeared on the shore? And let's leave this thing and go see what's up. We don't really know.
These two here have very prominent shoulders.
Yeah.
And then I don't know. I mean, we saw that other one earlier, which still had the bedrock attached
Yeah.
to it, but
There's some good examples like that. Like there on the left-hand side, you can see it straight up and down.
this one here,
Next to that fallen one. Yeah.
yeah,
Is that, see, it's all flat. So they haven't finished it yet.
yeah, it doesn't have a curve to it in a way.
Yeah.
Like that one has a really distinct curve to like the back of the
There's
neck.
Because that's the head, and it's got the nice shoulders there. And it's interesting to look at the fallen statues too, because those are statues that basically, from what we can tell, they started to move and then blob fell on their face.
Yeah.
One of the things that we noticed when we were doing our survey is the statues are in between the quarry and the ahu have bases that would force the statue to be leaning really far forward, very consistently. And that's a really critical attribute for transport, for walking. You can see that in some of those statues.
Yeah, interesting. It's hard to tell if that didn't render as much more eroded as a much older one.
Yeah.
If they're very soft stone, is the preservation of these things a challenge?
It is. I mean, one of the reasons why the community asked us to fly this is because there was a grass fire that came through here in the fall of 23. And they're very concerned about the impact. And they, of course, they didn't, without a record of a good documentation, how do you know something changed? So that's a big concern, because of course hot fire will cause the stone even more friable. There's also animals like horses and cows, and they'll come and rub themselves against the statues, and the stone will get worn down. And of course, the bad actor tourists want to break things off the statues. It's fairly soft, so people can do that. And then natural weathering. There's a lot of concern about the weathering, and people have looked at putting coatings on the statues to try to preserve the surface. There's an interesting attitude from the Rapanui people is that in many ways, traditionally the statues, because if you think about the statues that were on the ahu and then fell down and became rubble, making and putting statues at the ahu was a process of achievement, and then they have a lifespan of their own, and then they fall apart, and then they become reused. That they should be making more of them, right? That this is the weathering is just part of the natural process of Moai themselves, that they're not meant to be forever. It's sort of preserved as a museum state. Of course, there are other people now that are like, no, we need to preserve them, because of course they're monuments and extraordinary things on their own. But it is an interesting aspect of the fact that culturally, these things are meant to have lives, and those lives begin and end as ancestors, not forever.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. They sort of have a lifespan of their own.
Yeah, because you do find them, like in the ahu, you'll find big giant heads, and they're just rubble. There's nothing magic, sacred about them at that point. They're just
But you can imagine if the disruption of the 19th century hadn't occurred, that there would be like still a name to it. In a sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I was just thinking of ones in different production states you mentioned here. This one here seems to still be, maybe it's a trick, but still quite a bit of bedrock there. Yeah. And then this one here seems almost completely ready to be moved.
That one's ready to go, yeah. That's got the really prominent shoulder. So, one of the points of debate is some people say, well, these were meant here to be the sacred landscape, and it's possible, it was no matter what, no matter what was happening, the fact that all these statues and efforts is certainly important culturally. Whether or not they were meant to be there, built to be there, it's hard to say. I think they're meant to be transported, and, lots of things happen why they would not decide not to do it. You don't see it, they're not systematically arrayed in a way that would look like, oh, these are the guardians of this space. They're kind of just below where they took them out of the top parts.
Considering with the example of the ahu, we know they could easily arrange them
absolutely
in a specific position.
They could have put them however they needed to, versus just the spots where they finished them.
Interesting. It's so cool. It's really such a unique spot in the history of humanity. There could be no writing if there was an attempt to write the complete history of humanity. No one could write it without Rapanui, that's for sure. It's so incredible.
It's remarkable. That's why one of our goals here was to generate this, and fortunately through this, now technology, share it, because it's a wealth of information about this incredible achievement that people don't realize, that it's just astounding what people were able to achieve here. And we really want to be able to share that, and also so that people make claims about the archaeological record all the time, but often it's like, well, show me, give me the evidence. So if we're going to make claims about organization and about how people are using it, this is the evidence that we have to show that. I think that's, archaeology needs to be better at being able to present information and generate falsifiable questions, build testable hypotheses and then go out and evaluate them. And here's the evidence.
Yeah,
and then,
yeah.
you know, at a resolution that's actually you could do something with. It's not approximation. It's not a map. It's a real version of what the quarry looks like.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure people watching this video right now are going to be scouring through this, looking for clues about how these were made, transported, any features that might not have been
I'm sure we'll find all
identified.
kinds of things too. Like there's just, yeah, it's just astounding all the details and things that are in there.
Yeah. Who's this little guy here?
There's a little face in there.
Yeah. Interesting. I will let you go, but that was absolutely fascinating. If anyone wants to read more, I mean, of course, explore the website. The link will, of course, be down below. Is there anywhere else you want to direct a viewer if they want to read more about Rapanui, learn more about Rapanui?
Read our book, The Statues That Walked, which gives us the story about how we got to this. And then, of course, the Ranoraku papers on PLOS, so it's open access, so everyone can download and read that. And that's got all kinds of references and stuff to read other things to follow up on that. But yeah, and definitely check out the ArcGIS version of the quarry, and let me know if there's anything cool that people find.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm gonna hit